and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Arirang here with our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome on board.
Hello, hello.
Thank you for joining me.
Hello.
The Moon Jae-in government has been subject to a fresh wave of controversy in recent weeks, this time over its economic policies, following a slew of data that showed lackluster employment rates and widening income disparity. Despite this, President Moon, via a media speech at the National Convention for the ruling Democratic Party of Korea, vowed to keep pushing forward with his income-led growth policies.
대한민국 대통령으로서 당원 동지 여러분께 자신 있게 말씀드립니다. 우리는 올바른 경제 정책 기조로 가고 있습니다.
So in this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with our panel of foreign journalists to discuss President Moon's economic policies and whether or not they are indeed on the right path. So let me begin with this question. On a scale of A to F, how would you grade President Moon's economic policies over the past 16 months?
I mean, it's really tough to pinpoint it down to one number, but I would give it an B, because most of the policies, like increasing the minimum wage or, for example, decreasing the work hours, are policies that I would also support in Germany. And I think those are his campaign pledges. He's just, realizing what he promised before he got elected. However, he failed in creating a consent among the population, among the society. So you could criticize him for that.
Okay. Thomas?
I kind of go back and forth. I would give it a lower grade, I think, than Fabian. Just because you have to look at the data that you just mentioned. I mean, you have to look at the impact now and whether or not that's entirely because of his policies. As president, you kind of have to own where the economy is now, and those, low growth numbers are under his watch. I think just the overall approach, the sense that, you need to really try to substantially overhaul the Korean economy is correct, but the application so far hasn't been successful.
So C, D?
Yeah, somewhere in that range.
Fred, what's your grade?
I will cheat a little bit, but I don't think we should grade him now. Economic policy, we have to judge the long-term effect, and it's way, way too early to give a grade. I mean, we see now, for example, in the US, where Donald Trump is taking credit for Obama's economic policies. Of course, you mentioned the figures, they are not really good. But that doesn't mean it's an effect of his policy. He just started it. It's the same in France right now. Actually, to prepare this show, I checked online what French economists were saying about Macron economic policies, and they all say it's too early to judge. We don't know.
Okay, all right. Now, the Moon Jae-in government's economic policies, they are based on three main key pillars. So income-led growth, innovation-led growth, and fair competition. And among these three pillars, income-led growth is the one that people are giving the most amount of attention to. So income-led growth is based on the notion that an expansion in household disposable income will have a knock-on effect on consumption and investment to create a virtuous cycle of greater economic growth. Now, this runs counter to South Korea's traditional economic model, which relied on big businesses driving exports and thereby growth through wage competitiveness and profit maximization. Do you think income-led growth model is appropriate for South Korea?
I can't predict the future, but I really hope so, because growth is not a purpose in itself. I think the economy should serve the people. And the interests of the big corporates are not necessarily the same as what the economy of a country needs. So I hope that the income-led growth will serve the people who will invest more and consume more. But I will maybe proven to be wrong or right in 2 years or so.
Sure. Thomas, do you think that increased disposable income will have a significant bump in consumption and investment?
I think as a theory, it makes sense, and I mean, you can even trace it back to when Henry Ford started the mass production in his factories, and he gave his workers, a raise because he realized we need people to actually buy the cars that we're making.
Sure.
And I think the model that you described before, the old South Korean growth model, that is not really working to the extent it used to or feasible anymore. I mean, there's that sort of top-heavy, export-driven growth is coming under a lot of pressure now already from outside forces, from China. I mean, there needs to be some kind of domestic, I think, stimulation and reorganizing of the economic structures. And yeah, I mean, I think in theory it makes sense, but I think the income-led growth theory hasn't really been fully tested in other economies. So I guess we'll have to see how it's going to work out.
Okay, so some optimism, and in theory, it should work. But if we have a look at the numbers, so data released by Statistics Korea on August 17th show that the Moon government's economic report card is far from rosy, showing a fall in job growth and a widening income disparity. And South Korea's political opposition has been quick to blame the Moon administration's income-led growth policy as the main cause of this employment shock.
제2의 IMF 사태가 도래했다. 일자리 대참사라는 한탄과 하소연이 연일 쏟아지고 있습니다. 문재인 정부는 일자리 정책의 실패를 인정하고 소득주도 성장 정책을 전면 철회해야 합니다.
So, Fred, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think the Moon administration should scrap the initiative altogether?
I mean, I do believe in income-led growth model. I think inequality keeps rising, and that's a huge, huge problem. The mistake that the Moon Jae-in administration did was to increase too fast the minimum wage.
Okay.
They increased by 16.5% immediately. And that creates a shock. And the problem is you see a lot of small companies, SMEs, who are just unable to suddenly pay for this bump in the salaries.
Right. I think he did it so fast to keep with his campaign pledge.
Yeah, and he wants to continue. He wants to continue to increase. I think the target is to increase the wages by 30% in 2 years.
2020년까지 최저임금 1만 원을 이룬다는 목표는 사실상 어려워졌습니다. 결과적으로 대선 공약을 지키지 못하게 된 것을 사과드립니다.
And I don't think that could work.
It's not realistic in your opinion?
I think it's good to increase the wage. You just have to do it more slowly. You need companies to adapt.
Yeah, sure. Now let's talk about the so-called fountain effect of income-led growth. Last year, when Moon Jae-in administration first came into power, Finance Minister Kim Dong-yeon indicated the possibility of a fountain effect that could be generated by income-led growth policies. But lackluster economic indices have given ammunition to South Korea's political opposition, who argue that the Moon government must abandon its income-led growth policies and instead take a more business-friendly and pro-market approach. So where do you stand in this debate? Do you think we should go back, we should revert back to that economic model where a strong corporate environment will have a trickle-down effect into higher consumption, more investment, and just generally better economic health?
I think in Korea, that model used to work, that it relied on the big chaebols, the big conglomerates, because it was a give and take. They also had a social responsibility, basically to care for the greater good of the economy of South Korea. But nowadays, for example, for a company, it doesn't make a difference whether it has the factory and the employees of the factory in South Korea, or whether it will deploy it to Southeast Asia.
Right.
The company wants to make profit. So the logic of the company and the logic of what actually the people want is not necessarily the same. But yeah, there should be a market-friendly environment. There should be competition. And I think right now there's one problem in South Korea. It's a very polarized economy. You have this successful conglomerates making profits. And then you have like this small mom and pop stores. Only 20% of them survive after a 5-year time. So we need an environment where also like medium-sized companies can provide jobs to the youth, for example.
Okay. Now let's have a look at some employment indices. According to a monthly job report released by Statistics Korea this past July, 27 million people were employed in total, with a mere 5,000 increase on year. This represents an 8.5-year low since January 2010. So, Thomas, do you think these numbers indicate a serious red flag in the job market, in the labor market of South Korea?
Yes, I mean, I think you can't look at it and not be alarmed to some extent. I think, as we've been discussing, certainly you can say that perhaps some of the Moon policies have led to that. I mean, I think, the raising of the minimum wage may have been too quick, perhaps coupled again with shifting the work week hours. But, at the same time, these are other trends that have also been taking place in some of Korea's, cornerstone industries, manufacturing, heavy industries, things like Hyundai shipbuilding. They're restructuring. They're feeling pressure,
Sure.
From outside forces. So they have plans for big layoffs as well. So I would say it's system-wide, maybe exacerbated by the latest changes that the Moon administration has been pushing through.
Okay, now if we have a look at the local media and how they have portrayed the current situation, as expected, the conclusions drawn from the same numbers, the same set of data, depends on where the media outlet stands on the political spectrum. So do you believe some sectors of the local media have overly been pessimistic or overly optimistic, on the other hand, of President Moon's policy so far?
Sure. I think it's not really a surprise. I tend to think, they're clearly trying to take advantage, especially because Moon has been so popular until now, and this is really kind of, blood in the water, not just for the media, but for his political opponents. So they're clearly jumping on it, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're offering a better solution. It's a political kind of vulnerability that they're exploiting, and I would emphasize too that some of these problems certainly predate Moon. So and the previous administration has something to do with that as well. So.
Right. Okay, so then this is the real question. As journalists, what do you suggest the lay Korean citizen do, the average person do, in order to accurately gauge the country's economic health when they're being bombarded with such conflicting conclusions?
As a journalist, you try to have different sources, so it's good to read press, both the conservative and the liberal press, so you can make your own opinion. And it's good as well to look at data, especially external data. For example, I checked for this show the OECD. They have huge databases, but I was interested in the inequality. And I was surprised to discover that the Gini coefficient, which is one of the indicators you use to measure inequality, France, Germany, and Korea are very close to each other. Yeah, exactly. And you're surprised. Oh, maybe you thought like Korea was more unequal than, and it's not the case. So it's always good to look at independent and like third-party information, neutral information.
Sure. Fabio, what's your suggestion?
I would really recommend, if you only read newspapers, you don't get the bigger picture. Like sometimes it's good to read a book from economists, for example, just that, Thomas Piketty's The Capital of the 21st Century was so popular in South Korea too, showed that there's an interest in economic questions. And newspapers, they are on a daily business, so they basically sometimes don't let you see the context behind everything.
Right, the bigger picture and where it lies in the whole spectrum. Okay, let's move on to next year's budget proposal. On August 27th, the government announced its budget proposal for next year, weighing in at a hefty 470 trillion won, roughly 420 billion US dollars. This marks a near 10% rise compared to the budget for this year, highlighted by a 22% jump in funds allocated for job creation. The job creation budget has been heavily criticized by opposition party lawmakers who accuse the government of trying to artificially create new jobs through state expenditures. Fred, what are your thoughts on the government's decision to beef up its employment growth expenditures?
I think it's good. The question is, how do you use that money? It's not easy to create jobs. And France tried, for example. France tried before we had they created a lot of employment in the public sector that was actually pretty inefficient and that didn't really help these people who were hired. It was supposed to be a springboard to get another job, but it didn't really work like that. So just increasing the budget itself, it's not enough. You have to be really smart and find some good policies after. And I don't think yet there is some details on how they intend to spend that money.
I would say that what the state can do, it can trigger the creation of jobs, but it can't be the solution. Basically, in public sector, in the bureaucracy, people work less efficient, how the state sometimes, spends tax money. It's not necessarily the best way. So to have a sustainable job growth, it can only be the start of something, but the state cannot regulate everything.
Okay. Let's continue looking at overseas economies with US. The US economy has been on the upswing in recent months, growing at an estimated 4.1% in the second quarter. Also, the US has added 3.7 million new jobs since the election of President Trump in November of 2016, while the unemployment rate lies in the 3% range, a near two-decade low. So, Thomas, do you think the average American citizen is feeling the benefits of this upswing?
To some extent, you can say yes, in the sense that consumer confidence is quite high and consumer spending is quite high. So that is some indication that people are feeling secure in the economy. But I think many of the underlying issues that helped get Trump elected really haven't gone away. I mean, the economic growth has been strong. GDP growth has been good and unemployment is low, but wage growth has remained fairly stagnant for decades now, pretty much, or grown much more slowly than income and wealth at the higher end of the spectrum, and the income gap is widening. And I think for a lot of people, they may see a GDP growth number, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have more money in their pocket. So I think there's some disparity there.
So let's move on to Germany. In the first half of this year, Germany's federal government saw a record budget surplus of 48 billion euros, which has been attributed to solid employment and business growth, as well as fiscal discipline. What do you see as the main factors for this huge jump in budget surplus?
So the foundation is that the tax burden is super high in Germany, so that there's a surplus can be a good thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing. I think if you count in taxes, then health insurance, pension insurance and all that, then the burden on the average people is, I think, one of the highest in whole Europe. I think Belgium is slightly higher, but Germany is really up there. And the other thing is, of course, the global economy. I mean, Germany is benefiting, for example, from the whole situation. It's an export-driven country. It's in that regard, it's not so different from Korea. And the trade surplus of Germany is really high. I mean, German products are quite good in many fields, and many countries, not only in the world, but especially in Europe, buy that.
And also unemployment rates, I hear that it's at a record low since reunification in 1990. How do you think this was possible?
Well, I think right now, most of the population, they benefit from the economic situation right now, except for at the lower end. Like, for example, if you're unemployed, there were a lot of social welfare cuts, but I'm always wondering, right now the mood in the society of Germany is not that good. There's a lot of sentiment against refugees, a lot of sentiment against the European Union, and I'm wondering why, because actually the people, materially from their wealth, they're as good as maybe never before. And I think there's a lot of fear that in the future we cannot sustain that. So actually the frustration doesn't stem from poverty or so, but it's more like a fear that maybe in the future we will not be as well off as we are right now.
So fear about it losing the current status.
Right.
Okay, now let's come back to Korea and talk about the income disparity. In addition to slowing job growth, the widening income disparity here in South Korea has also set off many alarm bells. Now, you mentioned an interesting statistic before, that the income disparity, the coefficient, is quite similar for France, Korea, and Germany. Would you say that the income disparity, this gap, is particularly serious in Korea compared to other OECD countries?
Yeah, there are just a lot of interesting kind of factors in the Korean economy. When the wage gap between genders, I think, is the highest in OECD. It's really tremendous. Just the sort of the difference between regular jobs and the number of self-employed or temporary workers is another source of a wide gap. So I think it's it's a problem that's going to keep dragging on the economy until they work it out.
One of the things as well we have to say about Korea is that even though the thing is that I think before wage gap was not so big, Korea in the 70s, in the 80s was a much more egalitarian society, and everybody was poor and everybody had the same chance to whatever was your background, you still have the same chance to develop. You could think like your kid will have a better life than you, which is not the case anymore. So that makes a big difference. So even though like figures and statistics are just that, they're just indicators. Indicators are just that. But I understand why people here feel frustrated and unhappy with the situation, even though on paper, the situation in terms of inequality is similar to European countries.
I mean, I would not over-dramatize it. So the inequality, as you said, it's not much different than France, Germany, but the speed at which the inequality is increasing, that's pretty high. And but is there a big recipe against it? I mean, of course, the state has to somehow regulate it, but that's how economies develop. Like the inequality in most big economies is increasing, and it has been so even, I think, because of the war. I mean, in Germany, for example, the war was the point where nobody had anything, and then
great equalizer.
Great equalizer. I mean, of course, a tragic equalizer. But I think Korea, for a long time, managed to have an economic miracle without where most parts of the population benefited from. So the inequality became a problem rather recently. I think it really heated up after the economic crisis, the Asian crisis in the 90s.
I've just noticed in the time I've been here, less than a year, a lot of, more so than almost any country I can really think of, Koreans that I've met and talked to in their 20s and 30s have a really pessimistic view of Korea. I mean, it's really been striking to me because I look around and I think I see the positive things, but and I know there's a phenomenon called Hell Joseon where people, and I think they're reacting to some of these structural issues of, the inequality in the sense that the, chaebol system is rigged for insiders, and that's, of course, it's only anecdotal, but it's an interesting indicator that if this younger generation doesn't think that they have a future in this country, it's not a great sign.
Okay. All right, I'll have to wrap it up there. We'll have the final question, which is, moving forward, what type of policies do you think Moon administration should implement in order to tackle this sluggish job market and the widening disparity gap? Perhaps successful examples from your own countries.
It's a difficult question. I think one of the problems is that young people don't have enough self-confidence. And when you see Korea, you have great infrastructure, you have a very educated population, it's a very safe country to live in. So I think maybe young people should get more confidence, and the government, instead of, should try to encourage people maybe to start new companies and try to find a way to give more confidence to the people.
Okay, and Thomas?
I mean, I think they should follow on the track of, trying to stimulate income-led growth and, trying to enhance the labor side of the economy, but also, they do need to be responsive to trying to have some market-friendly policies as well to encourage growth. And, I would say any way you can to kind of diversify the economy away from such a top-heavy, chaebol-centric approach to allow small and medium businesses to grow and to flourish, and that may include, training. Instead of these people that are 45 years old leaving their job and starting just another convenience store down the street from the next one, job training and focusing on industries that are growth industries in the future and technological development.
Okay, and Fabian, what are some possibilities for the Moon Jae-in administration to implement?
I don't want to give concrete policy examples. I'm certainly not qualified for that, but I want to lay the focus on one thing. I think the Koreans have always been very strong at adapting. For example, there were not many natural resources here, but the people were always changing very fast. You can see that even now, especially Seoul, but Korea itself is always a look into the future. How people use modern technology, how they always have their mind looking to the future and don't want to lag behind new trends. Also, the older people, they are really adapting to the new situations. That's actually why I'm not worried. And also, you have the internet infrastructure here. The government invested smart in what other countries also in Europe only saw much later. So I think we shouldn't worry too much about the economy of South Korea.
Okay, all right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's inevitable that the same economic phenomenon will be interpreted in many different ways, depending on one's perspective and political motives. Nonetheless, we hope the Moon Jae-in administration will continue to listen to those various concerns in order to ultimately achieve a people-centric economy. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.